Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back at it again to talk about the new affix changes and affix updates for the War Within. With this, they're continuing with the same exact format that they had previously for Season 4, where heroic difficulty is on the equivalent of the Mythic Zeros that we saw in Season 3 and before then. And keep in mind that Mythic Dungeons are no longer, or not going to be available until Season 1 begins of the War Within. So the first couple weeks are basically just going to be you doing normal and heroic dungeons throughout. Keeping in mind, the other part of it that is a really interesting change, that Mythic difficulty is now going to be a daily lockout. So this is actually going to be really good for like gearing up your alts, prepping them, and it's going to have the vault rewards added on top of it. The dungeons, we mentioned it previously, Stone Vault, Dawnbreaker. This is the like dragon riding dungeon. Arakara, City of Echoes, City of Threads, Grimbatol, Necrotic Wake, Mists, and for some reason, Siege of Borealis. That being said, they're also changing around how the affixes are going to be set up. 2s is Fortified and Tyrannical. 4 is this new passive affix, which we're going to show in a second. And 7 is a pared down, it's a reduced version of some of the affixes that we're already going to be familiar with. So their goals for the affixes, they don't like that the affixes are having mechanical overlap between affix and dungeon trash design. So having to dispel something or having to CC something while you're also fighting the trash mobs. They want to make sure there's sort of like synergy where you're fighting things at the exact same time as you're dealing with the affix in the process, right? So their focus is shifting the source of challenge to the dungeon itself by simplifying affix design and emphasizing creature abilities. So what this really means is that like if casts are getting off, or if you're letting this mob alone or you're not focusing it down, then you're going to get really heavily punished by it. Less visual noise, nameplate clutter, and the cognitive load on players during trash combat. This is kind of weird because I've been doing non-stop dungeons ever since beta was released, and there's a lot of casts going off from these mobs. We haven't seen the other dungeons like, you know, Borealis or Necrotic Wake or any of those other ones that might be revamped or changed, but the ones we can actually see right now have a ton of casts going off and have a ton of stuff going on with them. So this is already kind of weird. And they want to allow for varied and context-specific gameplay decisions depending on the dungeon they're applied to. This sounds super weird, and when I show you the affixes in a second, it might make a little bit of sense here, and I can zoom in a little bit more if you guys want to read in as we focus on them. But I don't know what they mean by this gameplay decision. These affixes will include a positive effect, so yay, kiss curse. The aim of these positive effects is to highlight different damage types each week, allowing each specialization additional opportunities to excel during the season. So basically, no matter what spec you play, you'd have an advantageous week. They should feel like a bonus, offering an advantage for different damage profiles each week without being essential to complete a dungeon. Players will have an opportunity to flex towards different talents, gearing options, and consumables to capitalize on these effects. So one of the big things that stands out is that if you're having trinkets that are dealing different types of damage, this could be really helpful. But let me show you what I mean with these affixes, okay? Reckless. Non-boss enemies, keep this in mind, it's going to be the trend for all of these. Without mana, ignore 20% of armor with their attacks, but their armor is reduced by 30%, and they take 10% increased arcane damage. So melee specs and arcane, boomy, evoker, some stuff like that get a bonus week. Non-boss enemies without mana, once again, are inflicting physical damage to their attackers when attacked. So this is thorns, basically. Every mob, or well, whichever affected mobs there are going to be dealing damage back to you, but they take increased holy and shadow damage. Kind of weird that holy and shadow are put together. I'm sure if I'm a huge fan of that one. Non-boss enemies with mana are inflicting 20% increased magic damage, but take 10% increased nature damage and 30% increased damage from bleed effects. And so now you're going to have, like, there's two sort of melee weeks, whether they're taking more damage straight up or whether they're taking more damage from bleeds. And then finally, non-boss enemies with mana have increased haste, but take 10% increased frost and fire damage. And so they wanted to indicate whether the affixes apply to creatures with or without mana, and these affixes will not affect every creature. One thing I've noticed so far in the War Within is that there's a lot of mini-bosses throughout all of these fights. So For example, at the end of the Priory dungeon, there's a mini boss which just radiates damage in like a 40 or 50 yard range of him. So if you step within 40 yards, you're going to start taking damage. And since he does not have mana, you might also just be taking even more damage on top of that from Thorns when you have it as the affix this week. They're saying it's not affecting every single creature, but if there's a lot of mini bosses in the dungeons they've shown us so far, and then it seems like they want to emphasize the affix on specific handpicked mobs every season, then it seems like you're going to get a really massive advantage for your run if you're in a fortified week and you have to kill off these priority enemies really quickly before they just murder you from all of the crazy amounts of damage that these affixes could possibly deal to you. You know, increased haste in particular could be really nasty because you can't just keep smashing kicks into it. You're going to run out of kicks and stops, and then they're going to cast you to death. Increased magic damage is punishing if you are missing out on those stops. It could also be incentivizing you to bring certain compositions that have enough stops, aka not priest, since you're lacking in those AoE stops, so that you're able to get enough taken care of onto that one. So it kind of goes on and on. I mean, some bosses are just naturally going to be dealing high levels of damage. I kind of like the idea of having some mobs dealing constant damage to you to make it so that, you know, healers are going to be actually important onto that one. But I don't know how it's going to go with something like Reckless, where the tanks are taking more damage. Because this one, in its entirety, is, you know, I mean, like, tanks really haven't been on life support for a while. So I'm not sure if that's going to be too much of a problem or not. But keep in mind, with the addition of affixes come the retirement of affixes. So Afflicted, Incorporeal, Entangled, Storming, and Volcanic are all getting retired. Which means that you are now only having Raging, Bolstering, Bursting, and Sanguine on the level 7 affix bucket. So you could have like, what, an 8-week rotation or something like that with your affixes and shuffle them around between, you know, these 4 in the 7 slot and then these 4 new ones in the 4 slot. But it pretty much boils down to 3 of these 4 affixes being affixes that people just didn't want and cause massive amounts of problem with tuning and design and the works. You know, you're going to be, it's almost like you have an Exodia week, but the Exodia changes. You know, if you have like Raging, you're going to really want to make sure you have an Evoker for the AoE Soothe. But you might also want to have an additional Soothe just in case for like a single target Soothe. And so if you're on the Attuned week, which is nature damage and bleed effects, then you might want to take advantage of having the Resto Druid in group because it has the Soothe and a lot of its damage is coming from those bleed effects that you have as well, right? It's really weird that it feels like they're going to like push or at least encourage you to min-max these things. And when they start talking about players having the opportunity to flex towards these different talents and gearing options and consumables, this, you could maybe argue works for some pures like mages. But then, like, what do Shadow Priests do? Like, what do Boomkins do? I mean, I guess Boomkin has some, like, weeks where they play Feral, but I don't know too many Boomkin players that love switching between Feral or Boomkin just to be able to get invites into their groups each week. And so it's this really weird, forced balancing in the same exact way that you're forced into bringing all of the classes into the raid for raid buffs. It feels very artificial. It feels really weird. It's like a substitute for actually balancing the game itself. And we've already been dealing with these issues of, you know, one-shots. I've made a million videos for healers about how one-shot heavy and bursty damage can be. And if you're just making mobs crank out more damage, or in infinitely scaling content, you have mobs that are just having massive amounts of increased haste, and you are having the affix combinations which stop monsters from being able to be stunned, make them deal more damage, or heal them if you're, you know, not killing everything equally. It just makes it so that these mobs are going to get more casts off, and they're having the passive effects rolled into it. I understand what they're trying to do so that you're not having affixes be the mechanics that you need to do while you're also fighting monsters. But then you're also forcing people to run certain compositions to have an easier time. And you might say, well, no one's forcing them to do it. Well, are we just going to start tuning like dungeon timers so that it's every dungeon's going to be like Fall, where you're going to chest the dungeon but rack up 30 deaths? And you're like, yeah, we eventually did it, guys. Great job. Like, I don't know. Those dungeons, I felt like I failed the dungeon, even though we still like timed it. It felt like bad to time those dungeons when you had so many failures and so many deaths along the way. I honestly don't know. It's really weird that they're talking about still experimenting with how Tyrannical and Fortified will work, because basically the 4th tier affix only impacts the trash mobs. So Fortified weeks are just going to naturally feel even harder all the time. It's basically like you've taken Fortified and rolled it and like broken it up into little pieces. So every week trash mobs are just going to be more annoying, but they'll be doubly annoying on the Fortified weeks when they have more health. So what's the point of even having Tyrannical and Fortified weeks if all of the 4 affixes just make the trash more deadly? And the only way really to stop these mobs is to kill them quickly with really high damage comps that are synergizing with whatever the affix week is, or having lots of shutdowns, which doesn't really work with this focused one because of the haste increases that you have. And so as a result, it's going to be weird having some specs like, I don't know, Havoc Demon Hunter, which have chaos damage and they can always have a good week no matter what. Other specs like mages, at worst, would have to switch specs to benefit from their bonus damage every single week. Specs like Shadow Priest would have nothing to jump to because, I mean, yeah, it might be nice as a Shadow main to go holy and do a little bit of damage as a healer, but I don't think that they're going to be tuning these dungeons around healer damage being so important that you need to kill it. And what are you left with? I don't know. I'm just baffled by this change. There's like a little bit of good in it. If I was going to have to pick something positive out of it, I like the idea of like certain mobs having thorns effects, but this feels like an artificial form of Beguiled, but you're making it every single week is like a different lieutenant that's sort of like empowered throughout the dungeons. And I'd have to imagine this is also a lot of work for them to undertake, because they're going to have to specifically pick and choose which mobs are going to be empowered the entire way. They haven't announced anything, not that I've seen at least, for when M+ testing is, and I'm also recording this live, so chat, did they say anything about M+ testing? When it's going to be? So who knows? Last time, actually every time we've done M+ testing, they've given us scrolls, and as a result, people have just dodged testing any of the affixes whatsoever. And so if these things are tuned really nastily, which they probably will be, and you can have scrolls and dodge the affixes in their entirety, you're probably going to have people just not test these affixes at all, and they just want to play the dungeons. And then they're going to go live, and everybody is going to be punished, and everyone's going to feel bad. So, Blizzard, if you want to go through with this, my message to you is you need to force people to play with these affixes, and you need to be ready to adjust these numbers or adjust which targets are actually going to be set up by this. With 2 months to go before the expansion, I don't know if they're going to actually have the room or be willing to make changes towards this. But just from the very beginning, it seems like they made these affixes and then they made the reasons up afterwards, because there's many different specs in the game that are not able to flex towards different talents or specializations to take advantage of these beneficial weeks. And you've added all of the affixes that people hate in the 7 tier. And so I don't quite understand. And yeah, for those who missed it, Reckless is the physical weak because the armor of the enemies is reduced by 30%. So there is something there. But boy, I'm not loving it right now. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel and everything like that, as we're going to have more updates coming for the War Within beta. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.